Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are in the world, and thank you so much for joining us in this live transmission from ISKI. Quick introduction first. My name is Debbie Archer. I'm Managing Director of ISKI Limited, which is one of the ISKI group of companies, and I'm delighted to have with me Lloyd Roden from Lloyd Roden Consultancy. A little bit at first about ISKI. I'll keep this very brief because hopefully you've heard a little bit about us in the past. We are a leading global certification body. By certification body, I mean that we're the people who provide the examinations, typically against syllabi and part of a larger certification scheme. We are one of the leading providers for the ISTQB, International Software Testing Qualifications Board scheme. And I know that we'll have a lot of software testing professionals tuning in with us now to hear all about state transition testing. A little bit about ISKI's exam delivery, because this is what we do, deliver exams. We have Pearson VUE exams. We also offer remote proctor exams and indeed exams after training with accredited training providers, and Lloyd is actually one of those accredited training providers. So I'm very happy to bring this mini tutorial to you all, and I hope you find it useful. Any questions, please do pop them into the comments box and we'll help you with those and at the end. So we won't we've already got some people saying hello. I won't disturb Lloyd as he's presenting, but wait until the end of the presentation and I'll put those to us. So please ask away. If anything comes to your head as he's presenting, stick it in that box. Lloyd, I'm going to pass over to you and ask you to do your intro, and then let's move into your presentation.
Okay, thanks very much, Debbie. Hi, everybody. Hope you're well. Hope you're keeping safe wherever you are in the world. And let's hope we get back to some form of normality fairly soon with this pandemic. But welcome to this session on state transition testing. And Debbie asked me to think of a mini tutorial of one of the techniques within Foundation and also the Advanced Test Analyst. And I chose state transition testing, a variety of reasons. Firstly, and this sounds really sad, and I'm sorry about this, but it is one of my favorite techniques. And that does sound sad. It sounds as if I need to get a life, really. But state transition testing, I think, is probably underutilized, and it's sad, really, because I think it can be very, very powerful. So, without further ado, let me introduce you to state transition testing and levels of thoroughness. Now, I want to begin by saying that there are a whole host of different techniques out there. There's state transition, decision tables, boundary value analysis, equivalence partitioning, classification trees, domain analysis, and they're like tools in a toolbox. Each of these tools that we have, these techniques, do a variety of jobs, and any master craftsman will know the tools in their toolbox. They will know when to use the hammer, when to use the screwdriver, when to use the chisel. And it's exactly the same with our techniques that we have. These are our tools that we need to master as testers and start to use these powerfully. So, state transition testing. What is it? Well, it's a technique that firstly can validate requirements. We can challenge those requirements with the use of this technique, and we can actually use it as a review technique. So we can review requirements by applying state transition testing on top of that. It's all about looking at error conditions. It's clarifying what those error conditions are, and anything with flow, anything that navigates from one to another, we can use state transition testing. So there are a huge number of applications out there that can be used, and it's anything with a button. Okay, anything with a button, whether that's a physical button or a virtual button that moves us from one state to another, from one screen to another, then we can use this technique. And those buttons can actually be physical on physical devices, or they can be virtual buttons that we click on. Mobiles, classic mobile telephones, mobile applications, really, really useful technique for that. And I'm going to show you different levels of thoroughness. And I'm going to give you my advice and in terms of the levels of thoroughness, but it is only my advice on this in terms of what level of thoroughness I would certainly begin to sort of apply. So how does it work? Well, it's sometimes known as a modeling technique because we use a model, a diagram that shows firstly the states or that the software can occupy. So this is an ATM machine. So the ATM machine sits in a wait for card state, and then when you put a valid card in, it then moves to another state, giving you a message saying, please enter your PIN. And as we move, and the circles here in the diagram are the states, and the transitions is the flow from one state to another. And this is where we start building up our diagram. And the inputs, or in state transition terms, they're called events, but they're basically inputs. I will say, I wish ISTQB would actually have commonality in this. In state transition, they're called events. In decision tables, they're called conditions. In boundary value analysis, they're called inputs. They're all the same thing. So event is an input. Okay, so we enter a valid bank card is inserted, and then it responds with a message or some action. And this is known as a state transition diagram. And this is the first part of state transition testing in actually to draw the diagram. Now, the uses, we have positive tests using the diagram. So a diagram will show you where we can go. So I can go from wait for card to wait for PIN to enter in the first PIN, which is invalid, and then go into menu. And I follow those arrows around, and it's all positive. The arrows are things I can do. But the nice thing about this state transition testing is that we can also use negative tests, and it's known as a state table. And we derive the state table, and I'll show you how we can create a state table. And in the table here, the dashes, okay, so wait for card and then cancel is a negative test. It's something that you want to try, or if you've entered a card and you try and enter another card, you shouldn't be able to do that. So I'll come back to the state table in a little while. Now, I just want to show a worked example. This is an actual a user story that I came across a few years back on one of my workshops, where somebody brought this user story and said, look, I'd like to know how to apply the different techniques. And I actually applied every single technique within the test analyst course, boundary value, partitioning. I also did pairwise on this, but I also used the state transition diagram on this particular worked example. And it was to be able to transfer money within a mobile banking app from one account to another. And it was, the facility was a drag and drop facility. So dragging and dropping from one account you've got to another account and then transferring that money. So this was the diagram. I sat down with the business user and said, okay, tell me about this. Tell me about this particular user story. And I like doing that in terms of a class setting or in consultancy, because I like them to describe this to me. And I usually have a pen and paper by my side so I can draw this out. So the icon was displayed, and you selected that icon for the drag and drop, and it asks you for a username. And if you put a valid username, it then asks for a password. And then from the password, it went on to the account if it was a valid password. If the username was invalid, it gave you an error. And if the password was invalid as well, it gave an error. If it was a valid username on the second attempt, it went into the password. And then if it was invalid, and this was their system, if it was an invalid on the second attempt on the username, then it locked you out. It was a security aspect. Valid password then went on to display account. And if it was a biometric login, so once you didn't have to do the password, but you could use facial recognition or you could use fingerprint technology as your password. So that was a valid biometric login. If log out from the display accounts, you could then log out of your accounts, and then you could use a drag and drop transfer. And it asked for what amount you wanted to transfer. You could also do a menu transfer. So at the top of the mobile application, it showed you a transfer option. So you didn't have to drag and drop, but the drag and drop was the new facility that was being introduced. You could cancel from the amounts, and it displayed the accounts again, and then enter in a valid amount, from that amount screen, and it asks to confirm. Do you want to transfer this, yes or no? And you select amount from the drop down. Again, it went to the confirm transfer. And then a couple of more, once you've confirmed, it went back to the display accounts, giving you a message saying the transfer has been complete. You could don't confirm, and then it would log you out. And I just wanted to show that as an example where, from a user story, it actually was, you were able to actually generate the state transition diagram. That's usually the hard part in coming up with the diagram. Now, in terms of coverage, we can go down to many levels of coverage with state transition testing. I don't know if you're familiar with the term, most people are, but happy path testing, it's the typical thing people do. So if you went back to this diagram, you'd say to somebody, okay, what is the typical thing you would do? And you would say, okay, I'd select it, I'd enter a valid username, I'd do biometric login, drag and drop transfer, enter the amount, and then confirm. And that would be and then log out. And then that will be a happy path. And then you could say, well, okay, have we covered every state? And the answer to that probably would be no. So then you would actually go and generate more tests to cover every circle. And then you'd ask the question, have we covered every line, every transition? Now, in state transition testing, they call this zero switch coverage. It was a guy called Michael Chow that came up with this technique, and it's called Chow's switch coverage. And I'll show you why it's called zero switch in a moment. But every line is covered. And then we could do every pair of lines, which is one switch. And it goes through an N switch is number of switches covered of length N plus 1. So if you've got zero switch, then that's one transition. If you've got one switch, then that's every 2 lines. So achieving 100% one switch coverage requires every pair of lines to be tested. So increasing in coverage. Now, this I mentioned at the introduction. This is my advice. Okay, my advice. I think you should certainly cover happy path. You should certainly cover every state, and you should certainly cover every line, okay, as a minimum. And then depending on the risk, depending on your system, then you start to increase the coverage, and you may want to go to every pair of lines if that particular part of the application is quite important and quite risky. Now, round trip coverage, this is when you've got all the loops in the state transition covered as well. So they call this round trip coverage, and that covers every line, not necessarily every pair of line, but it's another type of coverage that is recognized within state transition. Now, I'm going to apply this technique systematically to a very simple example. I'm not going to do the drag and drop transfer because the diagram's quite not complex, but I just want to simplify the example so you understand how you can generate the happy path, how you can cover every state, every line, and every pair of lines. Okay, so this is 3 attempts of a pin of an ATM machine. Okay, so you insert your card, and if you then put a valid pin in, you go S1 to S2 to S5, and it goes to the menu. If your first pin attempt is wrong, you're going S1 to S2 to S3 with another message saying, I'm sorry, you got your pin wrong. And then if you get it right, it goes to menu. And then if your second attempt is wrong, it goes to S4. And then if your third attempt is wrong, it keeps the card. And after a minute, it will then return back to the original state. It retains the card. So that's a state diagram just for 3 attempts of a pin on an ATM machine. So let's have a look. A typical transaction, happy path. Now, people listening, those of you who probably don't use ATM machines that much nowadays, but if you were to use an ATM machine, I bet 99% of the people listening will go S1 to S2 to S5. We know we've got a valid card, we know what our pin is, and we go on to menu and we can select cash withdrawal. So that's our happy path. Question, have I covered every state? The answer is no. So therefore, I want a further test to cover every state. So now I do my second test is S1 to S2 to S3 to S4 to S6. I want the system to keep my card. In fact, that's a really good test because it's part of security, keeping your card. Now, the question now, I've covered every state with those 2 tests. Have I covered every transition, every line? And the answer is no. So I need further tests to cover every line. So I've got one where it goes to the second try, which is valid, the third try, which is valid, and then the first try I press cancel, then a second try I press cancel, and the third try I press cancel. So I end up with basically 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 tests. Okay, and in those 7 tests, I've covered my happy path, I've covered every state, and I've covered every line. So there's my 7 tests, okay, my typical transaction. By the way, this animation took me ages, okay, so please be impressed with the animation on this slide. And the next slide, it took me even longer. So here's my typical transaction. I've covered S1 to S2 line, and I've covered S2 to S5. Every state is the typical plus I've gone S1 to S2 again, and then my new lines I've covered S2 to S3, S3 to S4, S4 to S6, S6 to S1. And then my other 5 tests will cover every line. And I've just put the transitions that I've not covered above. So S2 to S1, that's pressing cancel. S3 to S1, that's pressing cancel from the second attempt. S3 to S5, the second attempt was correct, and it goes to the menu. S4 to S1 is the cancel from the third attempt, and then S4 to S5 is going to the menu from the third attempt. Now, how do we generate the pairs? Okay, called one switch coverage. Well, the way I do it, and it's been sufficient for me for the last 20 years. So this is how I do it. I start in S1 and I say, where can I go in 2 lines from S1? And I can go S1 to S2 to S1. Okay, S1 to S2 to S1, that's a pair of lines. Where else can I go from S1 in 2 lines? Well, I can go S1 to S2 to S3. Where else can I go? S1 to S2 to S5. And there's no more pair of lines from S1. Then I move to S2 and I say, okay, where can I go to in 2 lines? I can do S2 to S1 to S2, which is different to that first pair here. So S2 to S1 is saying, I'm going to press cancel, I'll put my card in, I'm going to press cancel, and I'm going to put my card in again. Okay. S2 to S3 to S1. So S2 to S3 to S1. And S2 to S3 to S4. S2 to S3 to S4. And I think S2 to S3 to S5. And that's all the pairs from S2. And I continue. Then I go to S3. Where can I go to in 2 lines? And so here are all my pairs. So I've listed them down here. Okay, so in this transition pairs, so we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 pairs. Now, this is the animation. These are my 7 tests that cover every line. Now, each of these tests also cover some of the pairs, okay? Because test number 1, my happy path, does S1 to S2 to S5, okay? My next, covering every state, S1 to S2 to S3. I've covered S2 to S3 to S4, S3 to S4 to S6, S4 to S6 to S1. And then my next, S1 to S2 to S1, and then I keep going through and I show you which pairs I've covered with those 7 tests. And the ones in red I've covered, which highlights 4 pairs that I haven't covered. S2 to S1 to S2. What's that? Well, that's, I put my card in and then I press cancel and put my card in again. Okay. S3 to S1 to S2. This is pressing cancel and putting my card in after the second attempt. The next one is very interesting. I would certainly test this. This is the 3rd attempt. Okay, so I've got the 3rd attempt message saying, I'm sorry, you've got your PIN number wrong twice. You've got 1 more attempt. And so this is pressing cancel and then putting my card in again. Now, I believe ATM machines actually keep a record due to fraud and everything. They keep a record per day on how many times you've used your PIN number on the card. And I think it goes back to 0 at the end of each day. I don't know for sure. If you want to try it out tonight on the way home or going out, just try, press your cancel, get your PIN number wrong twice, press cancel, put your card in again, and then try twice again. And I'm pretty sure your card will be kept. And then S6 to S1 to S2. This is the point where your card has been kept and you're pressing cancel, trying to get your card back and putting your card in again. That's probably very infeasible. You probably won't be able to do that, but it would be nice to try it and see. That's where you're crying at the ATM machine because it's kept your card and you're trying to get your card back. Okay, so that's positive testing. Negative testing is using a different notation called a state table. The state table is constructed from the state diagram. Okay, and what we do is we list down all of the states in the first column, and on the first row we list all the events. Okay, we ignore the first cell, and then we complete the table. Okay, so here we go. The size of the table is it's 6 by 7, but the first row is a heading and the first column is a heading. So these are my states and these are my inputs. So from state S1, from the diagram, if I insert a card, I go to S2 in the diagram. From state S1, which is waiting for card, I'm trying to put my PIN number in without entering a card. That shouldn't be possible. I try a random number. That shouldn't be possible. I try and press cancel. That shouldn't be possible. Nothing happens. I stay in the same state. And I wait 1 minute. Okay, that's another event in the diagram. And it still should stay in the S1 state. Then I move to S2 and say, okay, I've inserted my card. I try and insert it again. Okay, I shouldn't be able to do that. Okay, it's putting a card in. I think a little barrier comes down to protect the ATM machine so you don't break it. And we complete the table. We go through and put in all the positives, which is the states as they appear, and all the dashes are the nice things we want to try and do. And try and test out, try to press those buttons that we're not meant to press. And they're known as negative or invalid transitions. So there's a double-edged sword there with state transition. The positive side of things, looking at going through the diagram and the levels of thoroughness, and systematically increasing the thoroughness. And then there's the nice stuff, which is trying things out with those buttons, or putting a card in when you're not meant to. Okay, so that's an invalid test. So what do I suggest? We're wrapping up now this quick whistle stop of state transition. Well, start with functionally sensible test cases. Cover the happy path. Cover other tests that you feel are functionally sensible, and then start to increase the thoroughness by saying, okay, I've done all of that, but there's some states I've not covered. So let's cover those states. And this provides a good regression pack. You've got to think of your system that you're testing. We could go, the problem we have with testing is that we can go on and on and on and on testing. And as I usually say, it doesn't, it just stops. It never finishes, it just stops. And it's the same with this. We can do 2 switch, 3 switch, 4 switch, 5 switch, 6 switch. But you've got to, wonder whether or not that's worthwhile, because you'll end up with really silly test cases, like you put your card in, press cancel, put your card in, press cancel, put your card in, press cancel. Well, okay, that's not really realistic. Now, some problems. I think our specifications are sometimes very unclear, to say it very politely. And I think the use of techniques, and include this one, can actually firm up in the business person's mind what they're wanting to do. And you say, okay, so you've done this and you press this, so where do I go now? What message do I get out, or what event do I need to have before I get to this one? And I think it can really help with the specifications, making it clearer. Determining what the states are can be very difficult. Often UIs particularly are easy, messages, but if we're using embedded software or we're using APIs, it can become even more tricky to actually generate what those states are going to be. Try to keep your diagrams simple. Very hard to do sometimes when our systems are quite complex. But what you could do is you could nest the diagrams. So I'd have a diagram for 3 attempts of a pin. I'd have another diagram maybe for cash withdrawal, another diagram for all the other events, and keeping the diagrams as simple as I can. So nested diagrams, this is where we expand it and say, okay, I'm not going to worry about 3 attempts of a pin in this diagram. That's going to be covered elsewhere. And also guard conditions. Sometimes an event might be qualified by a condition previous to the state, and so they're called guard conditions. And if you move to one state and then you could end up going to 2 different states with the same input, but it depends where you've come from. They're called guard conditions, and that can be quite tricky as well. So what about bugs? Can we find bugs? Absolutely. Incorrect messages, incorrect events and actions. What about your initial state? What about the end state? You should have an end state, or be able to go back to the start state. What about how to reach that initial state? Once you've gone into the state diagram, and also you're going to be finding navigational type defects. Some people go over the top and create lots and lots of states unnecessarily. So again, just pull back and keep your diagram as simple as you can. Okay. So I've come to the end of the presentation, but in my description, I mentioned a tool. I said I'd demonstrate a tool. Unfortunately, one of the problems with state transition testing is that there are not many tools on the market to support this technique. There's tools that support classification tree. There's tools out there that support decision tables. There's tools that will support pairwise testing, for instance. But when it comes to this, it's quite tricky. There are a couple, but I've not really found the tool to be particularly useful. However, I have come across a modeling tool that is free. It's called Lloyd. And by the way, I'll send Debbie and Alex, I'll send you my presentation if people want it. And I'll also send the link to this Lloyd as well. This is a free tool. It runs on Windows, it runs on Macs, and it runs on Linux. And what we can do is we can start generating our states, and then we can start to draw from the state. We can actually draw the diagrams. I'm hoping there you go. So, and I don't know if you've tried drawing diagrams in Word, but it is really, really tricky. So this is a really nice tool. It's free of charge. Download it. It is, as they say, a modeling tool. And I downloaded and used this a lot for state transition testing for the diagram side of things. I did purchase another tool called Smart Draw, and it cost me $100, and I thought this is going to be better. And I've gone back to Lloyd. Lloyd I find to be so much more user-friendly than other tools. But as I say, it helps with the diagramming, and that's one of the hardest things, is creating the diagrams. So I thought I'd mention that to you. So I've finished now. Whether there's any questions, if you are planning to do foundation, you will need to know state transition testing for the exam. It is a K3 level question, and in the advanced test analyst, if you go onto that, it actually goes up to a K4 learning objective, and you need to know the up to the pairs. With foundation, you need to know the transitions and be able to recognize the diagrams and the state table, but in the advanced, you need to go that one stage further. So it's worthwhile. But certainly, I would really recommend getting into this. It's a fantastic, I really like this technique. As I say, it's one of my favorites. So Debbie, over to you. And we finished this little bit of a mini tutorial. So over to you now, and see if there's any questions people have got. Hello.
Hi, Lloyd. Thank you. Thank you so much. You've actually answered one of the questions that came through, and it was regarding the questions in the exam and
okay.
So thank you very much for that. And so it's in the foundation syllabus and also in the test analyst 3.0 syllabus.
Yeah. So at foundation level, you're likely to get maybe two or three questions on state transition, and they are at a K3 level. So you need to be able to apply your knowledge. But at advanced level, it's a K4. So they will give you a scenario, and then you have to start to apply it. And you may even have to retrospectively, create the diagram from the table. That's part and parcel of the syllabus.
Yeah, really helpful. So Peter says, thank you very much for a great tutorial. He also asked the question, I think this is related to another question we had as well. Can it be said that the state transition testing technique is most suitable for UI? And with that, a question about why do you think state transition testing is so underutilized?
Well, yeah, it's more. I think it's more applicable for a UI. I think when you've got those movements, from one screen to another or one state to another, then it's more useful. We can then visualize that movement within a state transition diagram. It's not impossible, but it's more tricky. Like all API testing or embedded systems where you've got messaging, it is more tricky because we're not visualizing, we're just getting messages out. But you could still apply it to those messages, and depending on what is responding from the API, the message that comes back, you can then generate the state transition diagram from that. Why is it underutilized? That's a good question. I think the tools, the lack of tools, I think prevent people from going, oh, do you know what? I can't be bothered putting the diagram together. But also, in more generically, I think the techniques in general are underutilized. I think people just go off and test, and they may intuitively use a technique, but they don't systematically use the technique. So they'll generate some boundaries in their heads, but they won't sit down and work out what all the boundaries are, for instance. And I think that's a common problem with all techniques. I think, and it is one of the time issue. It's a time element. But one thing I would do, just to encourage people, even in a review of a requirement, I've used these techniques and I've quickly drawn down a diagram thinking, now, in my mind, have I really understood what this is doing? And I would then take that to the review and say, okay, guys, my understanding is when this is done, this is what happens. Am I correct? So you can use it in that way very powerfully.
Very good. I think I might line you up there for a couple more of mini tutorials, maybe some VBA, what have you.
Yeah. No.
Another question for you is, why do we need both the state transition diagram and the state transition table?
Well, the diagram is the positive. So the diagram shows somebody, okay, this is where I can go. This is what I can do. And they call that positive testing. That's really, you follow the lines and you should be okay. The state table gives another dimension, and it's I wonder what happens if I do put two cards in, into an ATM machine. I wonder what happens if I try and press the cancel button when it's kept my card. And it's those type of what if scenarios that aren't necessarily the correct way of doing it, but you're trying things out. And I think that I like those things. It's and this is where you get the developers come back to you and say, well, why would you want to do that? And you go, because I'm a tester. That's why. So so it's those fun stuff the table gives you.
Curiosity. Should this technique be used all the time, and one might not be appropriate?
Can it be used? Yes, I think it can be used all the time. I think, if your systems are very, very complex, you might need to break the diagrams down into smaller modules and chunks. Going back to what I said on my first slide, they're like tools in your toolbox. Okay? Now, I can use a hammer for almost any job. If I want to put a screw into a wall, I'm really frustrated, I can use a hammer, and it helps with my frustration, but it's not the best tool for the job. And so there might become a point where and this takes practice, years of practice, in recognizing what technique is best for the situation, what tool is best for this job. And I just encourage people, try these out. And if you get stuck, it might not be the best technique to use for that particular job, but sometimes it's good for your frustration. Just hammer it away.
Oh, we're a little bit over time, actually, so we'll come to a close. We've got some thank yous here from Catherine, Janetti, I think Remy. Scroll up. I don't think we've got any more questions, but thank you from me and from the team at ISKI, Lloyd. Always a pleasure, and hopefully we'll see you again very, very soon. Thank you to everyone who's joined us.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Debbie, and thank you, Alex, as well, organising it. So take care, everybody, and keep safe. Definitely.
Bye.
Bye.